So hey Nime fans. The series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with Rwby. So let's start the series. Naruto shouted when God Sasuke, the self-proclaimed rabbit goddess, smacked him away. The ground collapsed on top of him, smashing him into it and sending him trembling. With every bone and nerve imploring him to rest and stop moving, the blonde flinched as he stood. Nevertheless, he disregarded those cries and concentrated on rejoining the battle, because he was a formidable and unyielding individual in his own right. He had a glimpse of his Naruto friend being slammed down next to him as he looked up, but he rebounded in midair and landed on his feet. Both were breathing heavily and were barely able to continue as they were. Because they were unable to touch her simultaneously, God Sasuke would prevail at this rate. Damn it, Nine Beast, do you have any ideas? Not an oh wait. Maybe I do. It will take a few minutes though, and you might be in even worse pain than before. At this rate I'll take pain over this bitch winning. Get to the tree, it'll take over from there. See if the Uchiha can get you a few minutes. Got it, NRDO friend. I'm right next to you, you idiot. What is it? Naruto put up his palm as the brooder winced and turned to face him. He was aware of its meaning. As before, the victorious Avenger sprouted his Susanoo and dashed back into the battle. 5 minutes. No problem. Naruto turned and headed straight toward the god tree, the Shinju. There were only a few flowers surrounding the base when he arrived, and if he hadn't known any better, he would have said it was lovely. The sage placed his palm against the tree and said, "Okay, Nine Beast, you're up." Then he let Nine Beast do his thing. While his mother was concentrating on the Uchiha during the period when the two reincarnations were separated, Zetsu was attracted to the fact that they weren't attacking as much. He was standing at the base of the Shinju, barely touching it, when he looked across the field. He was perplexed at first, but as his bond with Mother waned, he realized that Brad is trying to unseal the Biju. How could he possibly know how to do that? Zetsu yelled, "Mother!" And diverted God Otsutsuki from his friend Naruto. Taking advantage of the situation, Indra's reincarnation quickly swung the arm concealing Zetsu away. As her arm flew to the ground and a new one grew out of the socket, God Otsutsuki screamed a little. "You insolent child, don't you see I'm trying to help?" The rabbit goddess said, narrowing her eyes. Before his friend could respond, she flew at him and landed a right hook into his jaw. Then, she grabbed his hair with her left hand and attempted to throw him in the opposite direction. But as soon as she touched him, he lopped her hand off and inserted a kunai into his. He had to dodge before her sword-like elbow slashed his head as it disintegrated to dust. "Naruto, whatever you have planned, hurry the fuck up." Nine Beast slid out of his meditation position and moved to his container, shrinking to the size of a horse. "Kid, I'm almost done. This is going to feel like hell, but it should be quick. Gonna be honest with you, Naruto. I don't know if you'll see me again after I'm done." What I'm doing could be considered treason against higher powers, though God Otsutsuki is higher on that list than me. The most powerful of the nine sat on its rear thighs. Figures emerged and lights flashed through the mindscape. Jayuki, Seiken, Matatabi, Isobu, Goku, Kakuro, Shikaku, and Shimei. They simply drifted in as if they had never been there before. Naruto grinned broadly at each of them until the words of Nine Beast finally caught up with him. "Wait, what do you mean never see you again?" Nine Beast gazed down without responding. Before he realized what was occurring, Jayuki glanced around and said, "Naruto, I suggest you brace yourself." The word "why" was on the tip of his tongue when a scream tore through his throat. As if to ease the strain on his central energy pathways, he suddenly collapsed where he was standing, alternating between clutching his head and falling down flat in the fetal position. In the hopes that they might at least try to help him manage the anguish, Matatabi and Seiken rushed to him. Seiken's sense of temperature produced bubbles that seemed to function on the outside as well, even in his mindscape. Nine Beast only gazed sorrowfully at his host. He was aware of what lay ahead. One of the gods, the real gods, would probably come down on them and whisk him away as punishment after they killed or sealed God Otsutsuki. If nothing else, he trusted Naruto to keep his siblings safe. In his pain-induced haze, the host who was supposed to hold all nine Biju turned to face Nine Beast. He spoke to Jayuki for a few words before the Eight Tails nodded. He gently rubbed Matatabi's fur, which resembled flames, while holding his hand against her. Even though it seemed to go on forever, the agony had significantly decreased after a short while. He simply laid there, constantly caressing the Nekomata as a dull, agonizing ache resonated within of him. In the actual world, 2 minutes went by before Naruto woke up. His body ached, but not as much as it had. In addition to the pain he experienced, was he whole? Even after the old man gave him that unique inner energy, he felt more energized than ever. Though they all knew she was playing with him, he witnessed his Naruto friend narrowly surviving against God Otsutsuki, and the roar of lightning rang in his ears. Even after giving his Kusanagi lightning core energy, the rabbit goddess was only irritated by his punching and slashing. She wasn't expecting it, so yes, he hacked off her hand and arm, but she was even more angry now than she had been before. The blonde gave my friend a boost of vitality, and he prayed that whatever it was would be finished quickly. Despite his strength and arrogance, he was aware that he would be murdered at this rate. But as he struggled with her, he realized something. It appeared that God Otsutsuki needed to exert more force into her sidesteps and more effort into her blows, as if she were growing weaker. The friend's eyes widened a little, and he glanced at the blonde at the tree over the woman's shoulder. You brilliant fucking idiot. Even God Otsutsuki was confused. She could not identify how she felt her power was being gradually drained away. As she sidestepped and thought about it, she realized that she was using more energy than usual to get away from Indra's strike. She could see that he was growing wary from the relentless attack, but she kept dancing around his blows, knowing that she would be there to pick up where he left off as soon as he stopped. God Otsutsuki's eyes widened as she realized what was happening, and it felt like a slap in the face. She could hear Zetsu's words singing. She caught her friend's left heel in her cheek due to a moment of distraction. The Uchiha only needed that to get a second wind. He returned to his right fist and threw it into her nose after deftly sliding the blade back into his scabbard. He walked on the air, slid behind the former queen, and kneed her head, snapping it forward, using his newly acquired ability to fly. In an attempt to catch the Uchiha off tempo, the goddess let out a cry of frustration and threw out her elbow. He saw the bone slide from her elbow and move to the left, reaching her right side, thanks to the Sharingan. She swung her arm around to chop off his head before he could do anything but duck and backstep. Rwby's pal nearly gave up when he looked up at her. The previously emotionless, majestic visage was now filled with an unholy rage that was focused only on him. She squatted down a little and began running in his direction. He used it as a kind of buffer between them, thinking fast as he flew through the seals for the Chidori ISO. He didn't have to wait long because Naruto showed up next to him. Wait, what? Naruto's friend asked, glancing to his right at the blonde who had seemingly materialized out of thin air. His name pierced his thoughts. I can't sense him, like he isn't even here. But his core energy, it's too damn bright. Sorry about that. It was more painful than what was described to me. The Avenger smirked and mocked, even though he was gasping for air. Like you, nothing is too much for me to handle. This idiot, Naruto's companion said, stealing another look at him, is exuding strength and confidence. What the hell, Naruto? If not for their attempted murder of one another, Naruto's gaze remained fixed on God Otsutsuki, a faintly panting deity who would have been a little sensual. All right, Naruto said, this is it, God Otsutsuki. And honestly, I think that if you weren't so determined to kill everyone, we could have been friends. God Otsutsuki gazed, his eyes still tight. Insert adrenaline as Shinedown. With a gentle breath, the sage's entire manner abruptly transformed. The foolish blonde who was constantly hurrying in was no more. A serious shinobi who intended to finish this fight and perhaps in any way he could now stood in front of her. A few of the ninja who were awake likened the appearance to Minato's entry into combat. The moment after Naruto's eyes sprang open, he was standing in front of her, slamming his fist into her face. She flew with wide eyes after the crash. In an attempt to gain ahead and follow up, the blonde squatted and ran after her. Otsutsuki screamed to a stop and straightened out. She reached out to him and swung her fingers at him like bullets, but Naruto only dipped and moved aside. He vanished just as she was about to try using additional bones from her Shikatsu Myaku. She and her companion Naruto had a bad epiphany at that very moment. My Sharingan. They can't track him. Naruto kicked her in the side from behind, sending her plummeting to the earth. Coughing, God Otsutsuki leaped to her feet and got up as quickly as she could. Because the blonde child had inherited the Shinju's abilities, he was more powerful than her. Here, she was the goddess. The child is not spoiled. The child immediately landed on top of her with a heel kick, forcing her head to the ground once more before she could respond. She tried to kick his feet out from beneath him by twisting her body when she felt the ground against her cheek. Naruto felt himself full, but he leaned back and performed a backflip to get himself back up. When he retreated, God Otsutsuki saw something about him. The garment that represented his oneness with that beast was not being worn by him. It was all him. That notion made her feel a little afraid, but she quickly smothered it. She would not allow him to even attempt it. She thrust her hand out, sending the blonde flying with a Shinra Tensei, and her Rene Sharingan pulsed. The sage struck the ground hard and was headed back toward her, slamming into a rock formation. This woman. I have to get Naruto friend near her quickly. She needs to be resealed and fast. Naruto friend, you ready? Though still in shock, the Avenger soon realized what was going on. With a nod, he began to approach God Otsutsuki. Before she had to dodge another fist aiming at the back of her head, she spun and punched the Uchiha a few feet away, and swatted away the one that was intended at her stomach. Before Naruto exploded into smoke that obscured her eyesight, she threw out her left elbow and hit him in the gut. When he attempted to kick her again from above, her Byakugan swiftly flared in pursuit of him and backstepped. Behind her, she observed the Uchiha hurling the lightning senbon. When the sage threw his own kunai at her from the side, she had to pivot and use the Rene Sharingan to absorb the core energy. Oh my god, Otsutsuki was panting. She had never needed to move so much. The others either passed away or avoided her. Naruto nodded and extended his fist to bump, saying, Kit, I can spare a bit more core energy, but after this I'll have to rest again. Naruto's power, which was already high, soared again as they made contact with fists. He couldn't concentrate on the fact that his cloak was different this time. In order to seal her, Naruto zeroed in on her and drew her nearer to his companion. The blonde's second blow nearly sent her head flying from its perch, but God Otsutsuki had to dodge the previous one. After snapping to the left, it used his speed to spin and give her a roundhouse kick to the side, which caused her to skid back even further. Her companion Naruto was right up on her, shocking her with all the lightning core energy he could generate. Otsutsuki's body froze and convulsed, but despite her best efforts, she was unable to move and was, deep down, resigned to her fate. Done in. By my own grandchildren. Naruto placed his palm against God Otsutsuki while sliding alongside his friend. It was strange. Despite his happiness, a part of him screamed in grief. He noticed a smile on the white-haired princess's face. The earth around them came together around her body as she started to rise in the air, attempting to create her new moon jail. You? Naruto and his friend turned to see God Otsutsuki's severed arm, but the black Zetsu was writhing inside his sleeve. After exchanging glances, the two reincarnations nodded. You wanted to be with your mother, right? Asked Naruto as he approached him, and Zetsu shuddered in terror. Naruto came over to him and took his arm. Well, he said, pulling his own arm back and flinging it in the direction of the emerging moon. Join her. They'll kill you, Ichiha. Just you wait. The battle between the goddess and the other shinobi in the country came to an end with that terrifying cries. End of song. In a state of conflict, Naruto gazed at the new moon. He shook his head, even though he knew it had to be done. No, there were no other possible outcomes. All of them would have been slain by her. He was about to thank his friend Naruto when he glanced across at him. But he saw the expression on his friend's face. He was jealous, just as he had been all those years earlier. Nothing. Naruto friend. Naruto friend. No response once more. Before Naruto could call out to him again, his friend's hand moved, and he turned to face him and said, Kamye. He had no intention of moving. He was dragged into the dimensional rift and vanished from this world. He heard the bastard murmur, I'm sorry, Naruto, before he was completely gone. Change in scene. His body ached as the wind blew past his face. That was eliminated by the enhanced healing factor from possessing the 9 Biju, not because of the conflict. His body resisted what felt like a slow attempt to alter his underlying energy. Although he could hear the Biju screaming and calling his name, he was unable to respond. He had no idea how long he was falling, but he was certain that hitting ground would hurt. In the jungle, the sound of earth shifting from force could be heard. And when you witness a body falling from the sky, you have to at least go and rescue it, even though typically you would just brush it off as a vengeful grim. Crow Branwen was out with the class that day, which was fortunate for the body. After taking a gulp from his flask, he turned to his assistant and said, Take them back to Signal, I'll be back soon. Tell Rwby and Yang to wait for me after classes. He then leaped out into the wilderness to look for the accident site. Given that it was a sizable crater in the middle of nowhere, finding the location wasn't too difficult. He slipped on it to get close to the body after moving to the side of the hole. He quickly inspected it to make sure there was no damage and found none. So he grabbed the boy and left the area. Right now, he had no desire to combat Grim. A few days went by in the real world, but it had been weeks for Naruto. Time flow in his mindscapes was both a boon and a bane. He had to adjust to the sensation in comparison to core energy, but it did assist him in receiving an explanation from his inner companions about what was going on. In a brief sense, it was the same, but its effect differed from its potential. To begin with, he acquired a power that he believed to be just as powerful as the Biju's Bijdama. Like the cloaks his friends gave him, it too felt like a protective coat running the length of his body. Fortunately, it appeared that his buddies were unaffected by the conversion and continued to feel normal. So he did what he always does with the time he had. Train. He trained his mind to employ his new powers because they are more mental than physical, even though they weren't as physical as jogging or push-ups. Unfortunately, when his body started to awaken, his training was over. He scowled slightly as he looked around the room. Ah, you're awake. Stupid hospital. Naruto turned to face the voice and saw a figure that resembled Rwby. Expecting this man to be a racist as well, the woman's ears drooped slightly as she saw him staring at them, but then she heard her patient's soft call, turned to see him up, and was about to rub her ears. She was a medium-height woman, perhaps 5'6", with brown hair that fell to her shoulders and a doctor's coat. Other than the fact that she had 2 cat ears on top of her head that twitched occasionally, she didn't seem particularly strange. Please don't. The denial was crushed when she felt his fingers graze the back of her ears, and she started purring shortly after, which had to stop abruptly when the door opened, and a man entered who, according to his acquaintances, had the same signature as the person who had brought him here. Expecting to see the nurse replacing the IV on his wrist, Crow opened the door, but when he found the man standing there, scratching the furnace nurse on her ears, he was at a loss for what to do, so he turned on his heel and walked away, as he often did in embarrassing circumstances. Sir, please, I'll need you to sit back down and let me run a couple tests. The nurse, half comatose from the took advantage of the moment, however reluctantly, to move away from him, but all she received was a blank look. Nani? What? Rwby blinked twice and asked his friends what to do, but they also came up blank. Matatani suggested that they bump fists with her, so he did, or tried to. When Rwby held his fist out for the nurse to bump, she just stared at him like she didn't know what to do, so he made the motion of bumping his own fists and holding it back out. The nurse wasn't sure how this would help, but she did it anyhow. They didn't anticipate being drawn into his mental world. When the nurse saw the 9 enormous figures, she flew back onto her butt. She knew they weren't grim because they weren't black and white, but that didn't make it any less frightening. The enormous blue cat-like figure, which she approved of, approached her slowly, and despite her instincts telling her to flee, she was immobilized by her fear of them. She noticed her patient giving the cat a really expression as she sensed another presence behind her. Please don't, Matatabi. The nurse glanced at her patient and said, I get you. I can feel the terror she's putting out. Rwby blinked as he glanced at her. Oh, that makes sense too, he said. He looked back at the large cat and said, thanks for the idea, Tabi-chan. The giant cat chuckled and said, kitties now know how to talk to one another, Naruto-kun. He hoped that he would be able to comprehend the other people as well. In his mindscape, the sage turned to the nurse and held her up, saying, hello, I'm Rwby, and I'm sorry, but Naruto's expression changed to one of seriousness, and the nurse thought she was in trouble for something she didn't know. You seem a little pale. The tense atmosphere was broken at that moment, and the blonde held a small watering pail in his left hand. He laughed at the expression on her face and willed the pail away to the groaning giants behind her, though they could tell she was less afraid. They left the Biju alone after saying, thanks for the help everyone, but I think she'd feel better out in the real world. The blonde was grinning at the nurse when she opened her eyes. I'll have to beg that you keep that a secret, she nodded blankly. No one would believe her anyway. She had to go get the crow guy anyway. He was responsible for him since being brought in. She turned and left. Rwby silently waved, and when the door closed he frowned. When she was brought to the mindscape he didn't mean to, but he saw some of her memories. Just like me, huh? After a minute, the door opened and a man who had allegedly brought him in entered with a blonde girl about his height, dressed in bike shorts, a yellow tank top, and a brown leather jacket. A smaller girl with black hair and red highlights, wearing a black and red shirt and matching battle skirt, followed by a red hooded cape, came in behind her. Hello, child. I'm Crow. To put it bluntly, what the devil happened to you? The blonde girl slapped the back of his head as soon as he finished speaking, and he'd scared and muttered something about being old enough to swear. The little girl just looked at Naruto curiously and said, gotta agree with old man here. Crow, the man, was now in a corner, using a stick from somewhere to draw circles in the floor. Naruto is my name. Furthermore, I don't know where I am. The blonde and short girls were taken aback when Crow, who was never serious, got back up and said, I wouldn't have believed you if the nurse hadn't told me you were speaking another language 5 minutes ago. I'm going to attribute it to some aura strength from wherever you're from, though, given that she informed me you bumped fists and miraculously learned how to speak ours. He slightly loosened his posture. So, I'll do you a favor and tell you a little bit of the history, and you tell me yours. Does that sound good? Coming up short on information wasn't good for a ninja, so he had to take advantage of it. Naruto thought in silence for a while. He knew a little bit about what had been going on from that nurse's memories, but not much more than that the land was called Remnant, the faunas were discriminated against, and there were beasts that plagued the land that looked like animals called Grim. Naruto put out his fist and said, okay, I'll bite, but it will be easier this way. We can take as much time as we need if we talk like this. Crow's eyebrows went up, but he then gave Naruto a fist bump, and his mind was blown. Naruto showed him some of his memories that matched the stories he had told him about how he got to Remnant, and he decided that he should only show Crow these things, because he had seen what it was like to be in a war, even if it was against animals. Crow then filled him in on the places he was missing, including the kingdoms, their leaders, the military, to a certain extent, hunters and huntresses, and the school that was training them. Crow sighed lightly and grinned, well, Naruto, that is quite the story. The two separated after a moment outside, and the two girls with Crow saw something in his eyes that they had only seen once, when he took them to visit that old man Ironwood. It was like kinsmanship, like a teammate and fellow fighter. The sage grinned at the Crow and said, thank you, Crow. Based on what I observed, I have no choice but to assist you in adjusting. I suppose you can see how important it is to me. Well, introduce yourselves to your new housemate, Crow said, turning to the girls while continuing to smile. The blonde girl yelled, what the fuck? You said absolutely nothing. He's staying with us after you touched his fist, and now your friend's Crow turned to her and saw the serious look back in his eyes. Yang. Believe me. That was all she needed to do, and she fell silent once more. Rwby glanced at the other girl with the mimetic gaze, and he knew instantly that she had a great deal of power within her. He climbed up a little when he looked into her eyes, and he saw that they were more pure. You, he said, and they noticed that he was staring at Rwby's eyes. You have silver eyes. Crow's eyes whitened slightly, wondering if Naruto could feel the power of that. No, he couldn't, he was just brought here. He doesn't even know the legend. He'll have to speak to Ozpin soon. In any case, he was thinking about Naruto's abilities, and he'll be in Beacon in no time. No one had ever looked into Rwby's eyes with such intensity before, and she blushed slightly. Thanks. Yang, on the other hand, spotted an opportunity and would even taunt her sister in front of Crow. Is the adorable blonde here the object of little sis's affection? Although Crow appeared a little irritated and amused, Naruto blushed with Rwby, and could already feel a strong bond developing. 6 months later. After escorting Naruto to the house he shared with his nieces, Crow asked him if he wanted to learn anything other than kunai and other ninja weapons. Thinking that it would be beneficial to learn about various weapons, he accepted the offer, and immediately fell in love with Crow's side. The way it curved menacingly called to him, or perhaps it was the 9 inside of him telling him it was badass, and that he should make his own. He made a hybrid scythe assault rifle. It is said that signal students make their first weapon, which is true, but some, like him and Rwby, made theirs before their final year. Since they were the same age, they were placed in the same classes and year, and Rwby didn't mind because she and her uncle as well as Yang had become close to Naruto more so than Yang and Crow, though. They all made similar weapons, and that, along with the fact that they were in the same classes, made friends with each other, though Naruto seemed to be better at it, and had an unholy love of cookies. Naruto sobbed when he discovered there were no noodle shops, and he had to find a substitute somewhere. Naruto's first weapon was a scythe that he chose to call Shinjutsu, New Moon. It was funny when Rwby named her Crescent Rose. When asked why, she blushed slightly and said, after every new moon there's a crescent. This was also her way of saying that she would always be right behind him, helping him when he needed it. She was a little angry when Crow was teaching them, and he seemed to just absorb the knowledge, and almost always performed a move flawlessly. If Naruto recalls correctly, he saw Crow sob as he mumbles something about having to work forever, and he sees it once and does it the first time. It goes without saying that he wanted to create another weapon to learn about, and since it looked more like a rapier with a pistol integrated into the handle, he called it Turplish. Crow shook his head and muttered something about paying a favor in, which he was meant to be learning now. With a final sigh, Crow said, "Godchild, you can really work me out." Considering how old Crow was, it was surprising. That being said, I did say that I would tell you what I mentioned about your rapier, Naruto replied, rolling his eyes. I couldn't help you because I work with my scythe and its forms. However, do you recall the old Ironwood I mentioned to you? Ironwood was given a nickname by his nieces, which Crow liked. You mentioned that he was instructing the other heirs, correct? Naruto nodded. Weiss the ninja nodded. I'm guessing that since you're too lazy to come with, you're sending me out alone to learn with her. The old scythe master nodded. Right, well she is using a rapier-like weapon as well, I guess you can see where I'm going with this. He sensed the sheepish head scratch Crow wanted to make. As Naruto moved forward slightly and whispered, that's actually okay, but my question, do Yang and Rubes know? He didn't want to hurt their feelings, maybe making them think he was never coming back. Yang was like a sister to him, and Rwby, well, he didn't know honestly. He couldn't describe it, but it felt like maybe there was something there. He wasn't good with relationships. Especially when he didn't see the blatant sign of Shion asking him to fuck her, as pointed out by Shikaku. It made the situation worse when Crow and Yang both looked at him and Rwby playing a game on the TV one day shoulder to shoulder, and told the two, we approve, just use, and then get cut off by Rwby, using her speed semblance to push them away. Naruto laughed and spoiled them by saying, yeah, they do, and they told me to tell you that you better bring them something nice back from Atlas. Ah, before I forget, what is it you wanted to show me? The sage stiffened a little, but he decided it was time to make amends, because Naruto had omitted all information about the Biju from the first depiction of how he arrived at Remnant. He bumped into Crow's and stuck out his fist, nearly falling when he opened his eyes again. It wasn't difficult for Crow to accept that Naruto had Biju in him after seeing him and Naruto at an airship dock an hour later, while waiting for the ninjas to ride to Atlas. Naruto, when you meet the heirs, go easy on her. Crow, displaying his tender side, said of Weiss, Winter, well plainly put, I don't like her, don't hate her, but I definitely don't like her. And I have a strong suspicion that the father of Winter and Weiss might also be involved in that. The airship arrived shortly after, and Naruto nodded after looking at the now apparently older man. He was taken to Atlas for his training, and when he landed a few hours later, he kissed the cold ground. Someone on the flight had been harboring some negative thoughts, and drew a small murder of Nevermore to the ship, and they wouldn't let him do anything, not even man a gun. Some of the shots from the nearby craft were a bit too close for comfort, but they passed through it. So you must be Naruto. Said Ninja nodded his head and held out his hand, not wanting to unintentionally bring him in like that nurse lady. Nice to meet you, he said, getting back up when he heard a cough, and turning to see a man roughly Crow's age wearing a slightly modified Elysian military uniform. General Ironwood. Crow described Ironwood's appearance to him, saying it would have been terrible otherwise. The general took the hand and briefly searched Naruto's eyes for something before removing it and grinning, saying, I think I'm going like you, kid. They started to walk inland toward a particular building, which had a large field with obstacles and an arena that was obviously designed for challenges. A girl with pure white hair and an off-white blue dress was running the course, and she was incredibly fast, almost as fast as he was without a couple of the seals he had to set. After nearly killing Crow in a spar, he realized he needed to limit his power, and he whistled softly. "A piece of advice for you, kid, don't let her catch you," Ironwood said, assuming he was whistling at Weiss, rather than the work she was doing. The general looked at the blonde and said, "Oh yay, he was going to have fun teasing this kid. She may be used to the suitors and such, but it definitely doesn't mean she likes it." Naruto blushed and stammered out that he wasn't looking at her like that, though in reality he was. "I'm just impressed at how fast she's going." "Alright, that's how she looks. Glyphs. She is capable of creating many ones." She didn't hate Franus, despite popular belief, because of her father and the company's reputation. Elementary if she infuses dust with them, or even the speed ones she's using now. They stopped talking when she finished the course, took a breath, and turned to see her instructor and a blonde boy with whisker scars on his face, despite their thinness. When she got close to them, Weiss greeted her teacher and sized up the blonde, and he did the same. After a moment, he held out the sword and asked to see hers, and she removed Mertenister from her side. She noticed a rapier that was not entirely different from her own, and Naruto caught her eye and carefully removed Rwby from his waist. After being taken in, Naruto learned a lot more about the world than he was initially told, thus he nodded respectfully when he noticed the dust canisters on the weapon's side, something he ought to have done with his own. Similar thoughts were running through Weiss's mind. The rapier she was holding was a self-made weapon, as evidenced by the small, unintelligible inscription near the handguard. She lifted the grip, examined the pommel's position, and deduced that it could be adjusted to allow dust to be fired from the barrel along the blade. Naruto grinned and said, "You know, I wish I had considered using dust cylinders instead." The two turned back to one another and returned the guns. Weiss looked at Ironwood and gave him a slight nod, a small signal they put up for potential suitors. A nod indicates they're okay, while a shake indicates she has something else to do. "I have ore to spare, sure, but I can't add elements to mine," Weiss said. "I actually had that thinking when I was having it manufactured. When combined with my appearance, it might be over in a matter of minutes." As a ninja, Naruto was able to pick up on the faint undertones of conceit in her statement, but he was unable to respond because it might also be true. Ironwood took the initiative and said, "This is Naruto, Weiss." Weiss arched an eyebrow. He will be studying the fundamentals of rapier combat as a favor to a dusty old crow. Why simply the fundamentals? Naruto made the point, "Well, I need a stable format to form my own style." The heiress gave him a somewhat surprised look, as rapier combat had been the same for a while. Perhaps it was time for a new style to emerge, and people would undoubtedly figure out a way to counter it, if she never had to fight another. Weiss waited weeks before asking for help, and this lad. Naruto just grinned. "Yeah, I have no problem with that." Ironwood raised his eyebrows this time, thinking ahead. "Okay, I'll help too if when you're finished with it, you teach me too." Yes, the common thought, darling Weiss would benefit greatly from this. 3 weeks and 2 months later. In the nearly 3 months that have passed, a lot has happened. Like Crow, Naruto absorbed the information from the general and heiress, and because he was picking things up quickly, he decided to share a little bit about himself with them, not his past, but just a few things here and there, and he had already begun teaching Weiss some of the moves to the style he had in mind. Being a ninja, he was nimble, and Weiss was already quick, so he thought she would benefit from it, though it was awkward at times. When she stumbled or lost her balance, Naruto was always there to correct her or catch her. When she failed to make a move correctly, Naruto took her back to his front and performed the motions loosely again, often observing her blushing afterwards and not understanding why. Even after learning about Shion from the Biju, he still had no idea what romantic feelings were. But today it was different. It was Weiss's test to be accepted into Beacon Academy, and he was told about Beacon and its headmaster, Osborn. He will have to wait and see what happens, but he didn't feel good about her test, but it wasn't because he didn't trust her at all. Rather, it was because of the room itself. There was someone here who gave off a bad vibe that he couldn't identify without entering 9 Beast Sage mode, and he didn't want that chaos just yet. Ironwood and Weiss's father were silently watching Weiss next to him, and as Crow had predicted, Naruto didn't like him because he always had the holier-than-thou attitude, and held Franus in a completely shite light. Spectators of Atlas, both Franus and human, were dispersed throughout the room, and Mr. Schnee wasn't so bigoted that he couldn't stop them from observing her flaunting. Everything was going well until the Elysian knight she had been scripted to fight sidestepped, swung its sword over her head, and slashed her to the ground. The knight's sword blade sliced her over her right eye vertically, just missing her actual eye, and slicing the skin above and below. Blood seeped out slowly and soon dribbled down her chin. Weiss flinched lightly as she stood, but she quickly overcame the surprise of being stuck and used her glyphs to dash around the knight and strike at the area on his back. Before long, the metal man was down and rendered inoperable. The moment was interrupted when Weiss felt someone walking to her with something. A quick glance up at the booth that held her father, teacher, and friend revealed they thought it was strange. And Rwby himself was no longer smiling. Weiss sat out of breath and looked up at her father, who was stoic as usual, Ironwood smiling lightly, and Rwby simply beaming at her, swearing she saw a sparkle on his teeth. She glanced at the man coming and became frightened when he ran at her and raised his hand, the knife's jagged steel gleaming in the dimly lit room. Bitch, she had to move. She was tired, but she had to move. Weiss's body resisted her and ultimately prevailed, but it didn't matter because just as the would-be assailant had come within 5 feet of her, a white-gray light beam struck through him, sending him flying across the room. Looking to her left, Weiss noticed Rwby a few feet away with a face devoid of emotion, his hand outstretched like a gun, and a strangely shaped floating skull behind him. She put the pieces together and let out a shaky breath, and Rwby helped her up. The other Ironwood students went to their training ground, where they had set aside a place to rest when teaching her the new style. This place was in the rafters, out of the other room occupants at the time, and Rwby had placed a ladder leading up to it, so that Weiss could easily reach it. When they arrived, they saw what appeared to be a room with a set-up table and chair, a couch, and a white TV. Rwby sat Weiss down on the couch and sat next to her, knowing that near death isn't the best feeling. He had sensed the hatred that man had been releasing, but it was so thick that he couldn't identify it. When he finally made his move on Weiss, the sage felt the source and had to move. He would have released the seals, but he didn't have the extra few seconds, so he decided to jump down to the arena, somewhat surprising Mr. Schnee. The reason he didn't use his semblance was because it either killed someone or put them on the path to death. He was as good as any chunin, even as a ninja, with all the seals on him, but it wasn't enough, so he settled for things the other way. He raised his hand like a gun and took aim just ahead of the attacker, then recoiled his hand as if he had just fired a gun, and heard the telltale sign of his semblance form and fire behind him. Weiss was trembling a little, so she just took a deep breath. Thank you, Rwby. Ninja simply grabbed her shoulder lightly and turned her to face him, but her eyes were still filled with fear, so you can't blame her. Weiss. She looked at his face and noticed his slight smile, and he said, it's okay to cry sometimes. All she needed to do was sob while her face contorted and her eyes were leaking tears. Today, Ironwood, a few lesions, and he were standing in Mr. Schnee's office. He was brought in to express gratitude, but as soon as they discovered the grim mask concealed on the body of the dog furnace, they immediately began to strike back against the white Fang. I want something done, General. After my family was attacked, you can't expect me to sit here and give a thumbs up. The one thing Rwby appreciated about Mr. Schnee was that, despite his lack of public display, he was a family man. And as I keep telling you, we can't do anything yet, Ironwood said, shaking his head. He groaned and sat down, saying, but there may be a way if someone is up for it. The general gave the blonde ninja a stern look. Nothing has turned up about them until after the white Fang has done something. I'm at least willing to listen. As Ironwood moved his other leg, he said, good. Admittedly, I thought you were a furnace until I saw you didn't have a single trait besides the scars on your face, and from what you told me, they might just help us here. Rwby could already see where this was going, saying, honestly it might not even work, but with those scars you can pass as a furnace, or at least a human who understands the plight they're trying to fight against. He was still a Konoha ninja, therefore it was half true to say, you know, I'm not at Legion, or in the military for that matter. I understand, which is why I'm asking as a friend rather than a military commander or even your instructor. And if not for me. Bastard was aware that he had to answer yes right now. Tell me where you need me, please. Additionally, inform Weiss that I will return for Returblish. Next week. He had to leave immediately, so there was no time for a proper farewell. To ensure that they would see each other again, he gave Weiss his rapier, and sent the items he had purchased for Yang and Rwby to Ironwood to send to Crow, along with a letter explaining the situation. Other than that, however, their little plan worked, and he was inside the White Fang. It was actually an accident, as he was making his way to Vale to begin his search there when the train he was following was attacked by the very people he was looking for. Surprisingly, there were only 5 of them, so he assisted. Fortunately, there were no humans on board. The train was controlled and manned by robots. He had no hesitation in tearing them to shreds. He had the Biju create an illusion over his whiskers that made them appear bigger, more angular, and roughly 3 years old, in order to give the tale he had in mind some degree of realism. When a teenager appeared out of nowhere, the White Fang members were obviously suspicious, but after seeing his face and realizing that he was shooting the robot knights with them, they decided to keep their blades out, which was made easier by the fact that they were losing before he arrived. When it was all over, they thanked him, but they continued to keep their blades out. He asked if he could talk to the current leader, and they all exchanged glances before nodding and wagging his head. They took him somewhere in silence for about an hour, and 2 of the members stopped him from touching him, since he couldn't smell it out. As the group entered the camp with a sacked individual, the sounds of conversation and eating were interrupted. No one was more perplexed than Adam Taurus and his chosen partner Blake Belladonna, who emerged from the tent they had been in just moments earlier to confront the group. Someone explain. and truth be told it was thanks to him. One of the members then walked in to announce that the task was successful. He helped the crew. Whether or not he fully knows who they are can be learned, he said, pointing his head toward the hooded man, as Blake slid beside him. That's why, too. Taurus agreed and instructed them to take off the hood, only to be mildly incensed when he discovered it was a human. He was going to kill the blonde sitting there when he looked up, and Blake shrieked behind him. Taurus sighed, and even though he was ruthless to people, he still felt pity for those who were the targets of the racism they created. Just this once, he said, referring to the 6 extremely jagged scars on the blonde child's face, 3 on each cheek, which resembled whiskers, and appeared to have only recently healed because they weren't entirely sunken in his face. My name is Naruto, and I used to attend White Fang rallies as a supporter when I was younger. My parents found me one day and banned me from attending anymore. I continued because I wasn't going to listen. My companion, a fox faunus named Kier, was crippled by someone at one of the rallies. I started punching the guy after flipping crap. All I could recall is the arrival of the police and my incarceration the following morning. Kier was injured by a free man, and she will never be able to walk again. They chose to put a child in jail because he defended a friend, but they did nothing to that man. I was furious because it was so screwed up. I was picked up by my parents, but since we moved, I was unable to attend another protest, since I didn't feel secure without a companion. About 4 years ago, after moving to Atlas, I made several acquaintances that I believed would be fine. I made the decision to tell them about my previous time in the White Fang. His hands tightened and shook, and his breathing became labored. Being a member of the original White Fang before it got more radical, Blake looked to him with pity because he was somewhat like her. She stayed because of Adam, but she realized that he hadn't changed as she had thought. However, Adam was thinking, this kid helped out before the new management and paid a price that wasn't necessary, but he still sought them out, despite how they were now. It was strange but not entirely unwanted. Yes, he wanted to make fairness rule supreme, but seeing humans, even if only one helped them, Adam said. I'm reaching out to you, but I'm doing this because of a certain agreement we currently have with someone else. I'm offering you a position with the White Fang. Blake was the only member in attendance who was astonished, but she was also pleased. But he's a human. Said another member. He may be human, but he has the heart of a faunus, Taurus said, turning to face the woman. When we were powerless, few people would defend us, but he did. He sought us out, but now that we are powerful, people are afraid of us. I'm not sure if that was bravery, foolishness, or hope. However, I am aware that despite his humanity, he supports us and exhibits his faunus heart. Adam broke the ties and walked behind Naruto, who was grinning with tears in his eyes. They had an elderly member to catch up with, so they pushed Naruto along and grabbed Blake on the way back to the tent. At that point, everyone was quiet. After 2 months, the White Fang were shocked that a human wished to assist rather than subjugate them, but it didn't even take a week for Naruto to gain respect from them. Since Blake accompanied him on the most of his raids and spying missions, he had become close to her. Adam was constantly occupied with other troops, and still didn't fully trust Naruto, so it was surprising that he had any faith in him at all. Perhaps because of his story or the sense that he was an older member, Blake had quickly become friends with Naruto. She was happy that he shared her opinion, that killing needlessly is only necessary to incapacitate people, so she was taken aback when Naruto approached her one day and said, "Hey Blake, can we talk?" Being a healthy adolescent, she had read more spicy books. In addition, because of the full moon and the fact that she had already been thinking a lot about her new partner, she naturally started thinking more naughty things about the two of them. However, before she could finish, she noticed that he had a serious expression on his face, so she put an end to her fantasies and moved in with him. To avoid being overheard, they strolled a few minutes away. Naruto turned to face her and asked, "Blake, do you think what we're doing right now is right?" "Of course she did," Blake said right away. She was thinking that even before he appeared, so when she was asked the same question by someone else, she knew the answer. "I used to think that it was yes, but now." She glanced down at the forest floor. Naruto threw his fists out for her to bump into after giving her a quick glance and making a snap choice that he hoped wouldn't end badly. She gazed at him. "How should I proceed?" "Just bump fists, damn it." After bumping fists with the fox and connecting her consciousness with his, the cat opened her eyes to discover that she was in an infinite white chamber. "Where are we?" "My mind." She turned to see Naruto. She looked back around the room then back to him. "But how?" "I need to show you some things and tell you the truth," the ninja moaned. Blake was more than a little perplexed. "I'll start with the worst of it first. That story I told you, it wasn't true. God, you're going to really hate me for this, but I feel like you need to know. I actually kinda figured that." Blake sighed, not completely. Naruto blinked. "Your story was mine, but I didn't have a friend get hurt. I attended every demonstration, rally, and stand-in, but I never once saw your mop of blonde." Even in her tone of resignation, Naruto could detect the betrayal in it as he glanced down with regret. "Please let me finish," he said. "I'm here on a mission by the Elysian military to gain information on the White Fang, but after today, She nodded her agreement, but he persisted. He shook his head. As I mentioned, my story wasn't entirely made up. I'm going to show you a recollection. Please understand that no matter how hard you strive, nothing will change. She reluctantly gave a nod. And? Okay, so I realize it's not canon or confirmed that Naruto had any form of physical torment made to him when he was younger, but for plot, let's make it happen. Naruto snapped his fingers and recalled one of his worst memories. Of being 4 years old and not staying home on his birthday. Blake was about to jump in when Naruto reminded her that it was a memory, and she looked at him to see his stoic face. The memory ended as the men left his room and went on happily, as if they hadn't just nearly killed a child and destroyed his mind. Blake watched in horror as they held down a child and sliced his cheeks open, just as they were on the outside world. They cursed him, called him a demon, and beat him with whatever they could find. Blake went back to him, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she gave him a hug. He held her tenderly for a few seconds before she retreated. Why, after viewing that was all she had to say. Because my friend wasn't lying either. However, he goes by 9 Beast rather than Kier. How is he can it is it even Blake turned and saw the shape of a giant fox towering above her. She dropped her jaw and babbled. Naruto chuckled lightly at her reaction, tossing her head back and forth between demon and container. 9 Beast is a biju, a demon that I suppose you could say resides within me, she said. We used to despise one another, but 8 months ago, a series of events led to our current state. Naruto glanced at his gigantic friend, who rolled his eyes, and said, yeah, whatever you sap. And I'm glad for it too. I was napping, so hurry up and go out. Naruto laughed and caressed Blake's forehead, and then they vanished, opening their eyes again to reveal the forest all around them. Blake turned to face him and said, Naruto, you. He averted his gaze, anticipating the worst, saying, you're just like the character in this book. After a few moments, the ninja looked at her and said, I'm glad you don't hate me. Blake moved a little closer and gave him a hug, saying, I don't think I even could. She backed off for a moment before turning back to the ground, and instantly lost his worry. In fact, he was happy enough to laugh, in which Blake soon joined. Remember our most recent mission? You mentioned that I shouldn't cover my ears because they were adorable as we were leaving. Naruto blushed slightly. Yeah, he remembered it. He felt his palm open and a ribbon fall into his hand. He looked up and saw Blake with her cat ears on display. Blake. I will make every effort to keep them out. Alright. And only because I lead Blake NRDO I have another mission. Let's move. Adam had crept close to them, so Blake's confession would be interrupted. Blake sighed and started to leave, but Naruto didn't. She caught his hush sorry, as he hurried out of the clearing with the intention of going back to Atlas and reporting. The entire White Fang, including Adam, would be shocked in the next 5 minutes because, despite being new and human, they had been betrayed. They had no idea that this would be the last betrayal, so she closed her eyes tightly as she heard his footsteps echo out, counted to 10, and then ran back to camp because she had to maintain appearances at the very least. After a week, Naruto arrived at Atlas quickly and rested first, then looked at the ribbon he had been holding on to the entire run, tied it around his wrist, and went to sleep. The following day, he went into Mr. Schnee's office and updated them on the events. General Ironwood sighed lightly, I understand. Regards, Naruto. You'll also be pleased to hear that Weiss is excited to see you at Beacon, despite his mild annoyance with you. What are you saying? Although it appeared that Mr. Schnee was not overly excited at the mention of both Skulls and Crow, the general grinned and said, the benefit of doing favors, my dear boy. I'm technically still enrolled at Signal and can't keep Crow from telling them to withdraw me. To put everything up, you might want to return to Vale. Ironwood went to Mr. Schnee and said, you know she feels for him, correct? I swear you're just like the Uchiha he told me about, Ironside said with a sigh before heading out. When Naruto knocked on the door of the house he shared with Crow, Yang, and Rwby the following evening in Vale, the despondent Rwby opened it without even glancing at him. Hello. When they couldn't go get ammo for Crescent Rose, he told Rwby this pun because he hadn't told any to his pseudo family since he arrived. Ironwood and Weiss quickly grew tired of him. Blake only laughed at puns about fish, and he hadn't told any to them since. Do you know what a sluggish kangaroo is called? A pouch potato. Still feeling down, she started to shut the door, but paused. A potato in a pouch. She looked back through the open door. Near the door almost flew off the hinges and smacked the wall, as Rwby gained flight as her semblance and leapt at Naruto, almost knocking him down. You blonde dolt. Yang arrived and did manage to knock him down. They got up and ushered him inside, saying, look, you caught us just before we left. Rwby wanted to visit that dust shop, and I'm going to town to get more information about Mom. Do you want to accompany me? With a wink, Yang concluded, I'll let you ride on my lap. Yang arched an eyebrow and said, or, I can take Rwby because I need to check something at the shop anyway. How do you plan on getting there? Yang, said the ninja, smirked and pointed out the window. Up the street there was a white and orange motorcycle just like Yang's. How do you acquire that? It appears to be an Elysian motor. They all got up to leave, you recall, because I had that task the general required of me. This is just a portion of his retaliation for it. Whistling, Yang mounted her own motorcycle and revved the engine as it overturned. Milk it for all it's worth, Nair. She then rode off. After making sure Rwby held on, the ninja laughed and removed himself.